which, from what I can recall, is a big theme of this episode. An episode called, appropriately enough, Do Canada. So the setup of this episode is basically that Homer decides to take his family on another one of their trademark crappy vacations, in this case to upstate New York. And while they're there, Bart and Lisa are clowning around at Niagara Falls, which results in Lisa accidentally falling across the border and winding up in Ontario. And here is where the episode officially kicks off.
Oh, sweetie, thank God, thank God.
Your daughter's fine, but I recommend a 5-day stay.
Of course. We'll take out a third mortgage.
Sir, you're in Canada now, where your healthcare is free!
So this is, of course, one of the great cliches that you always see in American depictions of Canada, an emphasis on the free healthcare and all that. And regardless of, whether or not we want to get into the conversation of, well, what is free healthcare? Canadians pay for it in other ways. But one thing that I think is important to remember is that in real life, Lisa and her family, they're Americans. They're not Canadian citizens, and the Canadian healthcare system does not exist to just provide free healthcare to any random foreigner who shows up. If you're a foreigner in Canada and you break your leg or whatever and have to use the emergency room, you would have to pay. I actually took a photo of the prices in the emergency room in the hospital near where I live, just because I want people to understand this. This is why these kind of depictions can actually be quite pernicious. If you are an American or any other foreigner who is visiting Canada, you have to get traveler's health insurance. Otherwise, you could wind up with a big medical bill if you get sick or injured while you're in this country. This idea that because the Canadian healthcare system is, quote unquote, free for Canadian residents, that somehow means that this is just this kind of like big open, medical system that any random foreigner can just waltz into and get any sort of treatment they want paid for. That is a completely inaccurate depiction. And I think that sort of presentations like this are actually a kind of disinformation that can actually be dangerous to Americans planning on making trips to Canada if they think this is how the Canadian healthcare system works.
I'm not delirious. In fact, I've never felt more protected. Not like back home.
Oh, hang on. Did you just say you don't feel safe in your home country? Lisa, as you're clearly a victim of political persecution who fears for her life, I must keep you in Canada, where you'll be safe and assigned your own hockey team.
Please not Ottawa. Please not Ottawa.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
So, independently of Ottawa being a terrible hockey team, which is a very funny joke, sort of the larger depiction of Canadian asylum, this is obviously completely inaccurate. If you're a foreigner who wants to seek asylum or refugee status in Canada, obviously you have to instigate that process yourself. The Canadian government does not conclude when they have decided that the country you come from is oppressive enough to keep you stuck in Canada indefinitely. Even if you're not protected by the Canadian Medicare system when you're in Canada, you are protected by the Canadian Constitution, and the Canadian Constitution grants a constitutional right to leave Canada if you so choose. So there is no way that the government could force Lisa to stay in Canada if she didn't want to. It is also worth noting that Canada does not officially recognize refugee claims from the United States. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that. It might be most accurate to say that Canada does not encourage refugee claims from the United States. This was an issue of some significance a few years ago where there was a sort of inflow of asylum seekers from the US trying to cross the border into Canada. These were immigrants to America who theoretically claim that they sort of feared the vindictiveness of the Trump administration and so forth. But these people could only get into Canada and make those claims if they crossed the border illegally. Because if you tried to cross the border legally at like a formal point of entry border crossing, the guards would turn you away because they would say, no, we don't recognize refugee claims from the United States. But of course, once you get into Canada, you have constitutional rights and there's a process that unfolds. So maybe there is something to this, but yeah, in the real world, you would be instigating that process. The government wouldn't decide for you.
Look, I'm fine, eh?
We're losing her.
Mom, I'm okay. They put me in a nice foster home with Gordon Francette here.
I like the way that the very typical Canadian couple is depicted. The man wearing the flannel shirt and this kind of very sort of square, kind of unfashionable woman. What did they say the names were? Those were like good, kind of stereotypical white Canadian names.
Home with Gordon Francette here.
Lisa, where should we go for dinner tonight? Harvey's or Swiss Chalet?
How about Mr. Submarine? Or Earl's?
Don't forget Humpty's.
Restaurant chains I never heard of.
So yeah, those are all restaurant chains in Canada. They're all sort of kind of middle class sort of places. I actually, I'm fond of such places. Swiss Chalet is a family restaurant sort of based around rotisserie chicken. Harvey's is like a fast food burger place. They don't actually have that many of them out here. Mr. Sub is just a knockoff of Subway. I feel like it's kind of on the decline these days because it is also objectively worse than Subway. And then Humpty's is a kind of middle-class family restaurant, sort of like Denny's. I associate it very much with Alberta. And then Earl's is this kind of restaurant where middle-class people go to feel like they're having a fancy night out. I don't really know if there's an American chain that is similar to it, but I'm sure there must be. It's one of these places where like the lights are kind of dim and all of the waitresses are very pretty and only wear black. And they give all of the food like really fancy names, even though it's still basically just like burgers and things. Women like to go there for their girls' nights and order lots of margaritas.
Can you fall in love with a country?
Alanis Morissette Elementary School. We all know who Alanis Morissette is, right? Famous Canadian-born songstress. There's some fun little things here in the classroom I can see as well. You can see they have the food pyramid of poutine with gravy, french fries, and cheese curds. Poutine is, of course, very iconic, sort of stereotypical Canadian food. And then over here, this is interesting. So they have these two portraits on the wall, and the bottom one is of Gordie Howe, as he was depicted in an earlier Simpsons episode. Gordie Howe was a hockey player back in the day, and Bart cut his picture out of a magazine and then mailed it to Mrs. Krabappel when he was like writing fake love letters to her, and that was who he pretended he was. And then on the top here, that's supposed to be John A. Macdonald, who was the first Prime Minister of Canada.
The science textbooks acknowledge climate change.
So the book is called Science by Scientists. This is really sort of more of an American joke. You can see that the textbook says not available in Texas. This is a reference to the fact that Texas is one of the major sort of textbook buying states in the US because its population is so large. And so as a result, the argument has long been that textbook manufacturers kind of have to appease sort of Texan sensibilities and the sensibilities of the Texan government, which is of course very conservative. And so as a result, things like climate change and evolution and, communism and whatever are sort of massaged in their presentation in a way that is sort of acceptable to kind of, the Republican ethos.
Class, let's give an enthusiastic but quiet hello to Lisa Simpson.
Hello. As an American, I'd like to apologize for something our president said about your wonderfully progressive prime minister. Is there any way I can send a note, or maybe I could...
Right this way.
Oh.
I don't really know what this is getting at, like this idea that somehow in Canada it's very easy to get in touch with the prime minister. I mean, I guess compared to America it is, just because Canada is much smaller, but it's kind of an odd thing.
I am really, really sorry about what our president called you.
I don't think about it. I've moved on. Weak. He called me weak.
Absolutely.
To start with, the depiction of the Prime Minister's office is very accurate. That's very much what it looks like. But this joke here is kind of based on a bit of a false premise. It is true that Donald Trump often made fun of foreign leaders and said very insulting things about them on Twitter. But that wasn't really the case with Justin Trudeau. Trudeau and Trump actually seem to have a mostly amicable relationship in comparison to some other relationships he had with world leaders. This tweet that they're referencing is, I think, actually one of the only times that Trump said something explicitly mean to Trudeau, certainly at the time that this episode would have been made. The other thing I know is that I believe that they wanted to get the actual Trudeau to do the voice here. Currently serving world leaders have made cameos in The Simpsons before. I know Tony Blair appeared in the Britain episode.
Hello, welcome to the United Kingdom.
Prime Minister Tony Blair?
But when they couldn't get the real Trudeau for whatever reason, they went with a Trudeau impersonator instead, who was actually very talented. He has some very funny videos on YouTube.
Let me ask you, does this look weak?
Seriously? Wow, that is impressive. Watch your tie.
So this is a reference to a viral photo of Trudeau from some years ago. Trudeau is known for being a fit man, and he likes to do little stunts, and apparently one of the stunts he can do is sort of elevate himself by his hands in this way. It was, the picture is somewhat controversial, of course, because, Trudeau's propensity to engage in sort of clowning has sort of angered a lot of people who are always like, whenever they see pictures like this, it's like, get back to work, Trudeau.
So let's Listen, if I could just ask you one question about the SNC Lavalin scandal.